Good evening, everybody. Hope you can join me tonight. Welcome to those of you who can, and welcome to those who are watching on Catch Up Another Time. So this is my Principles, Peyton Principles of Good Health series that I continue to run every Tuesday night in my Facebook group at 6 p.m. It's barely a week that I miss when I don't run this, but I'll always put a note out in my Facebook group if I can't do it. And if you're watching this on Catch Up on my YouTube channel, then do come across to my Inspired Lifestyle Choices Facebook group and come and join it, where I give lots of advice and tips like this live tonight. So I've given this topic tonight an interesting title, MicrObesity. And the reason for my talk tonight is that when I look ahead at some of these awareness days and the ones that I pick out of particular interest to me and my audience, which is around gut health and nutrition generally, and health generally, then I saw that this coming Saturday is designated World Digestive Health Day. That's Saturday the 29th of May. And they do a different theme every year. And I happened to see that their theme this year was about obesity. But in fact, they weren't linking obesity to what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I thought this was just a perfect opportunity for me to review the links between obesity and what is going on in the gut. There's lots of research that's now showing that there is a link, just like we are understanding the link in so many areas of our health and disease states today that are linked to an imbalance in the gut microbiome and other problems that are going on in the gut generally. So before I start, just a few statistics that I think are quite useful to know about with regards to obesity here in the UK. And the last stats I could find was in 2019, that's not that long ago. And this estimated that 28% of adults in the UK were classified in the obese category, and that's with a BMI greater than 30. BMI is not something that I use generally, but it's a useful indicator when we're trying to classify people. So anyone with a BMI greater than 30 were classified as obese, and that was 28% of people. In addition to that, if we add in those that are overweight with a BMI of 25 to 30, there's a further 36% of people. So if I can do my maths correctly, that's 64% of the population that are classified as overweight, with nearly 30% of that are now moving into the obese category. And those figures only keep going up and up and up year on year on year. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about other perspectives other than diet and exercise when we think, because there's so many people will start diets and struggle and they just don't work. And I thought it'd be really interesting for me to approach this, a fresh approach, and talk about the links with the gut, the microbiome, and therefore what steps we can take to approach weight loss from a different perspective. But when we look at obesity, it is not just a weight problem, because obesity is so closely interwoven and interlinked with what we call metabolic disease. So this is linked to insulin resistance, poor glucose tolerance, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and then of course, when type 2 diabetes gets completely out of hand, then there are more chronic things that come into effect. Quite chronic and serious health conditions come into effect. It's linked to cardiovascular disease and hypertension. So it's what we call these metabolic diseases, when the body is struggling to cope with weight and glucose and cholesterol and higher fat, liver fats, triglyceride fats. These are all really closely interlinked, and they all very much have an inflammatory marker associated with them. So the greater drive of inflammation in the body is driving all these conditions as well. So just what is linking the gut, the microbiome, and obesity, and what have we found out about it? Well, what we found out is not only do we know about these hundreds of trillions of microbes that live in our gut, and that some are beneficial, and we know that some are not beneficial. They're pathogenic to us, and there are particular strains of these bacteria that are driving this inflammatory state in the body and driving this link to obesity. So, in terms of all these species, there's over 1,000 species identified. It can weigh up to 2 kilograms in the body, 10 times the microbes as cells in our body, and very much driving our health and controlling us overall. I really believe that quite firmly now, that it is exactly, it's what we eat, but it's its influence on our gut microbes that's driving our overall health today. Now, these pathogenic bacteria, just a tiny bit of science that's really important for me to explain, that some of these pathogenic bacteria are called gram-negative. When we do stool testing, we can see this very, very clearly. But some of these gram-negative bacteria have an outer membrane, and they sort of shed what we call lipopolysaccharides, LPS for short. So these compounds, these LPS compounds, are toxic to us. They damage the gut membrane, the gut mucosal lining. They damage that. They make it really permeable. They create inflammation in the gut. But when these toxins, these LPS compounds, which are toxic to us, pass through into the bloodstream from the gut, they become endotoxic. So they create toxicity around the body, and they drive inflammation around the body. So we've got strains of pathogenic bacteria. Some of them have this outer membrane. They shed these LPS compounds that damage the gut lining. They get through into the bloodstream, and they trigger what we call systemic inflammation around the body. And when they did tests in mice, and there's been lots of different studies now, but certain tests on mice, when they sort of like tried to pump these LPS compounds into the mice, those that were lean mice, what happened to those mice is that it drove triglyceride fat in their liver. It created insulin resistance. It increased fasting blood glucose levels. That's the one they're going to start measuring when they start to look at diabetes. Is your glucose levels in your bloodstream when you haven't been eating, is it remaining high? That's what it means. And it increased adipose tissue weight gain. Now, the reason why there's this close link between glucose and insulin resistance is that if blood glucose stays high, yes, long term it can lead to type 2 diabetes, but this glucose has to go somewhere in the body, and it will invariably be converted to fat, this adipose fat that lives around our abdomen, around the middle, and creates this other fatty layer around our organs, which is so damaging to us, and it's hard to move. So that's why all these things are so closely linked. In humans, similar thing, it reduced insulin sensitivity. So the body becomes, what that means is the cells don't respond to insulin. And it's insulin that is like a messenger that is telling the cells to take glucose out of the bloodstream. So that's what it means. So when we hear about poor insulin sensitivity, what it means is that the cells don't respond to insulin, and it inhibits and impairs the uptake of glucose into cells. So it keeps glucose levels high in the bloodstream. And as I just said, it does mean that glucose can then be converted to fat, driving weight gain, driving this greater incidence of obesity. So the important thing for you guys is to think about what we can do, what steps can we take to start reducing levels of these LPS bacteria. But it's always a delicate balance. So it's not just about the LPS bacteria, it's about the overall levels of bacteria and the balance, and this dysbiosis picture of too many pathogenic these LPS strains of bacteria that can then drive down levels of good bacteria, the beneficial ones. And what we want to do is drive up levels of the good ones that help to crowd out room for the bad ones. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's pretty much what we're trying to achieve here through the dietary steps that we can take. So the first thing is to think about your dietary fibres, following a plant-based diet. That is always first and foremost what we want to aim for. It doesn't mean you've got to be vegan or vegetarian, but we do want to be substantially increasing our plant-based foods, increasing the diversity, and having at least 30 different plant foods every single week. But when we're thinking about how can we increase levels of good bacteria, we want to think about what drives the food that feeds them. There's a particular compound called butyrate that helps to feed good bacterial strains of bacteria. And these are found in polyphenol rich foods, the red foods. When we think about plant foods, we want to think about the red ones. So think about all your black currants and your berries, your blackberries and your blueberries and your red currants, your strawberries. We want to think about pomegranate, red-skinned apples, plums, red legumes and red rice. So all those red plant foods are rich in these polyphenols that are going to help feed strains of bacteria to help produce butyrate. And what butyrate does is it then helps to feed other strains of good bacteria, and it helps to support levels of a healthy mucosal lining, so it stops the mucosal lining being so permeable. We want more soluble fiber in the diet, so we want things like oats, we want more brown rice, and we want apples. And stewed apple is a lovely thing to eat because it's rich in pectin, and it really helps to feed the good bacteria. We want to increase resistant starch. Not many people have heard about resistant starch. It's a relatively new type of fiber, and it's found in the plant cell walls, within that cellulose cell wall that's trapped in plants. So we find it in soaked, it's higher in soaked rather than cooked oats. So when we eat, say, overnight oats, we're going to have a higher level of that resistant starch. It's found in cooked and then cooled food, like rice. If you cook it and then you cool it, you're going to have high levels of resistant starch. The same with a jacket potato. If you cook it and then you cool it, there's going to be high levels of resistant starch. It's high in green bananas. They may taste a bit odd, but you're going to get resistant starch there. And we find it in legumes like chickpeas. So those are all the ways that we can start to feed the good gut bacteria, this fiber that's not digested by ours but is fermented by the gut bacteria and acts as this fuel, helps to create levels of butyrate. Butyrate is going to feed the bacteria and help to heal any sort of leaky gut, the mucosal lining there. And this in turn is going to help reduce strains of the LPS bacteria. And it's also been found with butyrate to lower systemic inflammation. So systemic inflammation is what's driving some of these obesity related conditions that I talked about above. It also helps inhibit glucose, improve glucose tolerance, and inhibit cholesterol synthesis, all these sort of metabolic type conditions that I spoke about before. You do want to keep eating oily fish, so we want to reduce fat. Sorry, one thing I didn't mention is about fat intake. What we have found is ketogenic diets and a really high fat diet is linked to higher levels of these LPS producing bacteria. So you might wonder, well, ketogenic diets, they're linked to weight loss, and now you're saying these LPS bacteria can lead to obesity and weight gain. And I think it's a very careful balance, and therefore ketogenic diets may work well in the short term. They shouldn't be a long-term approach for weight loss or for health overall. Short and sharp is how I would use a ketogenic diet. You may want to follow it for a month and then get off it again and get back into a normal eating routine, but always keeping the plant levels high, very, very high. Don't keep on a ketogenic diet long term. You're driving higher levels of these LPS bacteria. And particularly if you're going more for the saturated fat, which is why the point I was just about to make was do keep eating the oily fish because of the beneficial fats that act as anti-inflammatory mediators, not only in the gut, but across the whole body as well. Probiotics and fermented foods these days, they're great in the short term, but they have more of a temporary impact on the gut microbiome. So useful short term, but it's more about the dietary approach there, longer term. So in summary, you know, the disease states we find in the body more and more are linking back to what is going on in the gut. Lots of research around different gut microbes and imbalances to different disease states in the body. And so it's no surprise to me that when we look at obesity, we can bring it very much back to what's going on in the gut. Of course, we've got to look about what we're eating generally. We can't live on rubbish processed foods. But I think it's very, very interesting, this link to these particular strains of gram-negative bacteria and the impact it's having on driving systemic inflammation, but particularly associated around metabolic diseases and obesity. So thank you for your time today, tonight, whenever you're watching this. Do invite others to join my group if you find these talks of interest and the other things that I post in my group. I'd love to drive this to a much bigger community, get more people aware of what I'm talking about. It's all about community and taking care of your health and your long-term health. So have a great week, everybody. And as usual, I talk about the weather because what else do we Brits talk about? But what I am pleased to see, certainly where I live and hopefully across most of the UK, is that I think the weather's looking up. I think we're getting more sunshine. I think it's almost going to be quite warm. Might even be t-shirt weather. Wouldn't that be great as we're heading into June and the bank holiday weekend? So I hope the weather's good for you wherever you are, and look forward to catching up with you next week. Bye.